Um, Welcome, everybody. I'm Helen Fisher. I'm the convener of the Equality Rights Alliance. I would like to acknowledge that we are all meeting on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm currently coming to you from Sydney, from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and although I respect the week of mourning and week of silence, I would like to say my heart is full. And that it is a difficult time. I would also like to say that we are holding this webinar at a really interesting juncture in Australian history for women's rights. We are working with a government who has made significant progress in relation to a number of areas around women's economic security. And so that's actually given us a bit of breathing space to be able to look up and say, well, what's on the horizon and what is some of that deep structural change that we need to see in our economy, in our economic structures, in order to be able to advance women's economic security. And one of the issues that keeps coming up in that discussion is the idea of a universal basic income in any of its many manifestations. One of the things that we have seen particularly over the last 10 years, but over quite a long period, is that the welfare system in Australia is not serving women well. We are seeing that women are sitting as the majority of recipients in relation to the disability support pension over long periods. We are seeing women as the majority of recipients of single parent payment and of age pension, and women as the people who stay on job seeker for the longest. So people who have been on job seeker for 3 to 5 years, the majority are female. And so the effective operation of our welfare system is a key issue for women's economic security. And yet we're not seeing women coming off those payments quickly enough. We're not seeing women being able to move into the economy quickly enough. And we're not seeing when women are on welfare payments that those payments are adequate for their needs, particularly their needs when they're providing unpaid care to children or to parents. And so there is a point for us to be looking quite deeply at the welfare system and saying, well, what is the structural change we need? And so today we're very, very pleased to be joined by a fabulous panelist, a panel of experts who are going to unpick some of the intricacies around universal basic income and similar concepts, and have a think about whether or not those possibilities are the sort of thing that ERA should be advocating for at the federal level. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Toni Hassan, my colleague, to run the panel. I will take my camera off so that you're not looking at my face the whole time, and let the panel begin. Thanks, Toni.
Thank you. A very warm welcome to Angela Jackson, a distinguished economist, to Elise Klein of the ANU, and to Helen Hodgeson at Curtin University. It's a delight to welcome you this morning and to explore the corners of this. I want to begin with Elise Klein, because you have a personal story really in your research in terms of how you came to be engaged in the subject of universal basic income or basic minimum income. Where did it start for you, and what has it meant to you or mean to you?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I also want to acknowledge I'm on stolen and unceded lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal this morning. I guess we all have personal stories about how we come into this space of questions of economic security. I mean, I'm a feminist, so I come to this space as thinking and bringing that sort of feminist tradition. But maybe before I sort of talk a bit about that, I think it's useful when we're talking about basic income is to think about what models we're talking about, which is, I think, what Helen was sharing at the start. And there is a lot of focus around this idea of universality, and folks, that I think in the sort of basic income space, probably aren't so fixated on this idea of universality, but you sort of see the debate and the discussion in Australia being closed down around that concept of universality. I mean, John Quiggin and others talk about sort of a stepping stone approach, so it could be more targeted, and then over time you could move and things like that. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind, but also, the other aspects of a basic income which is, you know, around about a regular cash payment paid to individuals. It's enough for people to live on. And it also, importantly, that it doesn't cancel out other payments. The other thing I wanted to just start with is also to say that it really matters about why we are talking about a basic income, and specifically what is it that it's meant to do.
Yes. Indeed, I guess that leads us to what is the problem we are trying to solve. Helen alluded to some of that, but is it simply about removing the indignity, the bureaucracy and the complexity or uncertainty in applying for unemployment benefits in Australia or elsewhere?
So I think why I'm sort of starting with that is I think it's useful to think about that in terms of the feminist view and why a feminist would think might want to consider ideas around a basic income, because, you know, a lot of the time it gets talked about as poverty alleviation, which of course is extremely important. But there are bigger debates that feminists bring into this space, and they are around transformative change. And so that is where sort of, I guess, I sort of come into that space because, you know, my background is thinking about international development, thinking about questions of justice globally as well as locally. And one of the big sort of tensions we see with the sort of promise of development is this sort of fixation on employment as economic security for everyone. And, you know, at a global level, that's a problem because, you know, most of the world's population are live in the informal economy, and basically development has said, okay, just wait and development will catch up to you sooner or later. And that's been happening for, you know, 70 or so years, and people are still waiting. So here in the sort of developed space, you know, I think the sort of question for feminists is to think about also this question of our fixation on employment as the space of economic security. And I think that brings up really important questions for a basic income because, you know, there's questions around the ways in which a basic income could potentially provide and de-link opportunities for economic security away from wage labour. As we know, the economy is not just the paid economy of employment, but of course the unpaid space. So, you know, a lot of the work that I do is working with a lot of women on social security, but also folks more broadly on social security. And one of the big injustices I think that folks are faced with is this belief that people aren't doing anything on social security. And whereas the reality is that people are doing huge amounts of work on social security. It's unpaid, it's often unpaid, care labour often, and it's hugely important and productive in the economy. But it's just seen as, you know, you have all this sort of deservingness and undeservingness discussion. So the feminist space and the feminist argument here is around thinking about what a basic income can do in terms of freeing our minds a bit to having such a fixation on employment. It doesn't mean no employment. It means for folks who are, you know, thought about as undeserving, thinking about the kinds of ways that they can also have an economic floor without the conditionality, without the punitive, and without the stigma.
Sure. Okay. So for people tuning in who are not familiar with the concept at all, we're talking about every citizen of a certain age getting a certain amount of money that would replace a lot of, if not all, welfare in place. You're saying certainly it needn't. Depends very much on the model. There's complexity there. But it would replace at least in the Australian context, the tax-free threshold, which is handed to people who don't work. That's a key idea. But where have you seen models of this in place, or, you know, during or in the wake of COVID especially? What is your research brought to the surface?
I mean, I think one of the amazing examples was what we saw happening during COVID. And it was kind of like an emergency basic income where you had a Liberal government basically overnight reducing the amounts of conditionality that folks receiving social security were receiving. So that was, you know, putting on hold mutual obligations and work for the dole, these kinds of very punitive programs, stigmatizing programs. an increase in payments. So it lifted a lot of folks above the poverty line. I think poverty went from about 68% down to 70%. And there was a relaxing of the means test, or particularly the assets test. So there was sort of broadening of eligibility criteria. So, I mean, it wasn't a universal basic income, but it was a form, it was a sort of a move towards basic income. And so colleagues and myself, Kay Cook, myself, and others spent some time working with folks who were living in this situation. And we asked people about what the positives were of this social experiment, this natural experiment, if you like, and the negatives. And overwhelmingly, people said it was hugely positive for their lives. That, you know, I mean, a lot of people talked about the material impacts, that they didn't have to ration medicines, food, that they felt more economically secure, but also the psychological impacts of what this did for people in terms of feeling more, you know, feeling like some people said, you know, I felt more human again. I felt like I was part of society again. But also what was interesting, we asked about what happened to people's time use. There's always such a focus on, you know, folks receiving social security and around basic income discussions around, oh, well, that'll just mean people will do nothing. Well, going back to my earlier reflections, people do a lot on social security, huge amounts of unpaid care work in terms of looking after kids, elders in the community, but also a lot of volunteer work. And people talked about how, without having to deal with mutual obligations and the state sort of chasing you and this sort of very punitive kind of cycle people are in, people could do two things with their time. They could plan better to engage more with the labour market. So a lot of people talked about, you know, working out study alternatives, you know, trying to strategize more about how they could get back into the labour market. But also with that time, people were able to better do a lot of that unpaid care work without the pressure and stigma. So, you know, of course, people are doing huge amounts of that care work, but they found it easier because they weren't under such social pressure.
It's a meaningless activity test that you're obliged to appear to meet, freeing up people, you're saying, to actually look for things that were meaningful to them. And so there are real gender implications, Elise?
Absolutely, because a lot of the people that we spoke to, of course, were women, and then a big chunk of those women are doing huge amounts of unpaid care work in terms of caring for kids, but also looking after elders in the community, neighbours. And they really reported how much these measures made such a difference in terms of the material deprivations they were faced with before and how that changed, but also in terms of the psychological and the sort of stress, and also freeing up their time to be able to do the things that they have to do. They need to do. They need to look after their kids, but yet that they're made to feel bad for that because there's such a fixation in social security around the primacy of employment as the marker of being a dignified human or not. And it completely overlooks all the unpaid work that folks receiving social security do.
A key idea here is that basic minimum income is not means tested, just to put it out there again. And so it goes to everyone regardless of their source of income. Now, to bring you in, Helen Hodgeson, you've been looking at what's been written and said about basic income, the different models, the pros and cons, and the global experience. Where did your research land, and would you like to sort of respond to what Elise has had to say?
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Noongar people here in Perth and pay my respects and respect the week of mourning that's currently underway across Australia. First of all, I completely agree with most of the concepts that Elise has been talking about, that it's all about dignity, having sufficient income, and doing away with the mutual obligation and that whole cycle of continually chasing your tail just to comply in order to be able to meet the requirements. But to me, I think the question becomes one of whether it is a minimum basic income or a universal basic income, because universality suggests that everybody is entitled to the payment, whereas a minimum basic income is saying that there are some conditions on it, and those conditions would be around making sure that you're not giving it to people who don't need this type of payment. But this whole idea of conditionality, I think, is one that's really significant, because the problem we have in our system at the moment is that the conditions are largely around participation and driving people to apply for jobs, some of which they'll never be able to succeed in getting, or don't meet their family and their care obligations, but they're being driven to do this in order to qualify for the income. The sorts of conditionality that I think is probably more appropriate is to say that people who are receiving adequate income from other sources don't need this extra amount. You can claw it back, and I noticed that Toni referred to designing it to have NBI instead of the tax thresholds. And this goes right back to what Friedman originally proposed as a negative income tax. The challenge is always going to be finding that tipping point. At what point do you say that somebody moves out of receiving the credit back into the point where they start to pay income tax? And there are all of these design choices that have to factor into the system. So in the literature review, the issues that kept coming up were, first of all, is it going to be is it exclusive, as in the only form of payment, or does it complement other payments? Is it universal or categorical? So do you have to be in certain categories to be eligible? Unconditional or conditional? Does it go to the individual or the household? Is it a cash transfer, or is it a tax credit? And in some places, like I think the Chinese system, it's a one-off payment rather than a regular income support. So all of these are design issues that need to be grappled with. And this is where the problems are. And you did refer earlier, Toni, to issues post-COVID. And I agree that what happened here with JobKeeper during COVID was an excellent natural experiment, and it showed what happens when people do have the income without having to meet those obligations. But the studies that tend to be cited are Spain and Finland. And in both of those cases, it was actually a conditional program. So Spain is income conditional. It only goes to people who are over a certain amount. And I believe that one is being scaled back. And Finland, it was very much a limited, a study more than a universal program. And again, that's being scaled back. So it sort of seems that where there is a place for this, it hasn't actually yet received, the design issues are such that it's been very hard to find one that works. The complement to this, of course, is universal basic services. And I think that there is a big scope here to sort of look at what we're providing people in addition to income and making sure that that is genuinely accessible. Now, here in Australia, the theory is that you have healthcare, you have schooling, you have all of these things that are provided and are available through the public system. But we all know that these gaps are emerging, and these gaps are requiring people to be able to fund things like schooling. Yes, you can go to your primary school, but can you go on the excursions? Can you pay for the books? Can you get a computer? And those gaps are often where the problem emerges. So there also needs to be a focus on universal basic services and housing, and that's a whole other debate. But we all know that while housing is so unaffordable, then none of these programs are really going to make the difference that we need.
Helen, would you at least say that one of the big attractions is that it sort of fixes the problem of a poverty trap, that under the current welfare system, people receive benefits, but as soon as their income rises, they lose those benefits and they're left sort of worse off. And I guess it leads to the sort of question around, if the current problem or system is that there are so many hoops to get New Start, why not just make the current system less conditional, right? Wouldn't that be easier than generating a new system, given how far we've come?
Yeah, and I completely agree that the problem with any form of means testing is how you design the withdrawal of those benefits once you reach those levels. And the theory behind the NBI was that that wouldn't happen because it would be a natural progression between one and the other once you work out what that appropriate tipping point is. But I think that, I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I guess you're suggesting I mean, I think there's a joke about an English tourist who gets lost in the countryside and asks a farmer, how do I get to Dublin? And the farmer replies, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And so we are a developed country. There are a whole lot of systems in place. So rather than generate or ask Treasury, perhaps it's pie in the sky, but to ask Treasury to investigate this, and as you say, there are design issues, given where we are, why not make New Start just less conditional?
Now, cards on the table here, I am an incrementalist. I do often find that you're better off moving progressively towards a goal. But in terms of, I mean, my background is tax theory, and you talk about either the big bang where you completely dump a system, redesign it and start from fresh, like we did when we introduced the GST, or you move progressively towards a goal, which does mean that along the way there are decisions that have to be made and adaptations that have to happen. I suppose that really is where the politics comes into it. Are we prepared to sort of go back and say, right, let's scrap everything we've done for the last 100 years and start from scratch? And I think that there are some parts of the program that should be dumped, but there are other underlying principles that I think would remain in place when you started to redesign the system. So I think that what we should be focusing on are things like the removal of conditionality and the approval of services as a starting point, and take it from there and see where it goes from there.
Angela, I'd love to bring you in at this point. How would you respond to what you've heard?
Look, I think, so there's a few, I guess, different ways of approaching it. In terms of, I take Helen's point. I think in the real attraction for me of UBI is both sort of alleviating poverty, which in of itself, while services are important, we know that income poverty just causes so many issues in terms of people's day-to-day lives, in terms of the impact of financial stress on mental health, on all these issues, right? And so just really, for me, addressing income poverty needs to be a priority in Australia as outside of services, that we can sort of try and squib it, but we know that it's hurting kids, it's hurting families, it's really, hurting individuals in quite significant ways that are quite avoidable. Like for not that much money, we could be avoiding a lot of this harm simply by increasing the level of payments. And whether you do that through a UBI or the current system, debatable. The current system, though, of course, if you did do it through the current system, is that issue around the effective marginal tax rates would be lifted, the incentives to work would be diminished, and our targeted system does create these real disincentives to work that creates huge inefficiencies and has a very gendered element to it as well, with women facing, the much higher effective marginal tax rates as opposed to men as a second earner in families. Now, huge progress, as Helen said, the incremental approach. If we go 20 years ago when I first started working, those EMTRs were over 100%. And they, with the modelling that came out of NATSEM, etc., people went, oh, wait a minute, and Treasury, this might not be such an incentive to work if women lose more than, they work for an extra hour and they actually lose money. Maybe we can improve this, but it's still at 70 cents, like Miranda Stewart's last modelling in terms of, average two people, average income, women are still facing EMTRs of 70 cents in the dollar. That's still very, very high. So I think UBI could try and alleviate that. But in terms of where we get to and what's the possibility of getting there, given the attitudes towards welfare recipients in Australia, given everything else, the politics of it seems very hard bridge to jump, and that perhaps thinking around the incremental is a better way of going. And so the types of things I'd be thinking about are those mutual obligation. I think they've been incredibly destructive for over the last 20 years. And I had a recent briefing around the jobs and around some of the reforms, and the head of, the job network admitted that mutual obligation is the centre of the job network. So all the training, mutual obligation, and all the support we give to unemployed people, mutual obligation is the centre of the system. I mean, how ridiculous, that this is meant to be the employment services, getting people back into work, etc. And it's all centered around mutual obligation rather than actually supporting people get the skills they need to get a job. So we need to really, I think, fight again that fight that these mutual obligations are quite destructive in terms of, making life worse for people on payments, but also economically not justified and really undermining the whole system. The other thing I would really like to focus on is the asset test, the liquid asset test. So one of the issues, as well as the level of payment, is that we make people become poor before they can even get employment benefit. And so by the time you can get it, people have run out of all other supports or buffers. And so I can't imagine the stress of trying to live on that payment and you've only got $10,000. It's just not a lot of money. We're paying rent at the moment, it's like $1,200 a week for a family home in Melbourne. So $10,000 is just not enough money to be thinking, that you can possibly live on what the payment of unemployment is. So I think there's some tweaks like that where we could make it a lot better. And then in terms of the political discourse, it really is, I think, around re-prosecuting issues around poverty, who is poor, the fact that it isn't the undeserving, that we could all be in that situation, and re-prosecuting this idea of, just like Medicare provides insurance if you're sick, we should have a system that insures us against these ups and downs in income that we might all experience through our lives. And there's work to be done there, I think, in the policy space around and the advocacy space, because Australian attitudes to this are just very, very, as we saw on the weekend, on a number of things aren't great, and also, acknowledge the week of silence. But in this space as well, we really do have quite negative attitudes, the Australian population, towards people on low incomes in particular.
Well, here. Thanks, Angela. That was great. I wonder if Elise at this point would like to respond, because what we're hearing is, there is a radical change, although, as you pointed out, in light of the pandemic, there was a Liberal government that moved in a direction that you applaud, versus incremental change. I guess, there's a lot to unpack there. But Elise, is there something you'd like to raise at this point, given your colleagues are saying we have what we have, there are things to do right now, that is, addressing the level of payment, addressing the liquid asset issue that absolutely drives people into poverty before they even get an unemployment benefit. It's so intrusive, right? How much do you have in your bank account? All of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. Can I just also say, that natural experiment was great, but I definitely was not applauding the Liberal government, because, of course, 6 months later they took it all away and people are back. And I thought that was extremely cruel. I'm totally following what everyone's saying, and I think, in terms of that sort of incremental and that question of what is politically possible in our current situation, I think is a very useful and important sort of intervention here. And, that's why myself, John Quigg and others created this livable income guarantee, which we also saw as another sort of possibility of, a stepping stone approach from where we are to moving in a more sort of progressive direction.
Could you explain what is meant by that?
So the livable income guarantee was looking at what could be used instead of the stage 3 tax cuts, and that allocation, and how that money could be reused to bring everyone who is on social security payments up to the level of the pension, the age pension. And there was also a sort of a discussion how that could sort of be thought about in terms of contribution. So this real sort of tension around this focus on paid employment as being sort of the marker of people's dignity in society, and trying to sort of break that a little bit, and trying to support all the kinds of contributions people make, all the different unpaid work that people do, and awarding social economic security, of course, because of your contribution, not your proximity to paid employment. But I think this sort of question about what's politically possible, I just wanted to also flag that there is an argument around the political possibility of a universal idea and how that can sort of support more buy-in across the board. So, I mean, the Australian story has been one of, the whole sort of story has been around deservingness and undeservingness since sort of, the British colonies, and the sort of idea of least eligibility and making social security so hostile that only the most deserving, the most needy could have it. And that's been maintained in various iterations through sort of since federation. And we're seeing really sort of the pointy end of that now, and making it so hostile to deter people from even accessing it. But that sort of mentality around deservingness and undeservingness has been the story of the Australian social security system. And so, there is an argument around universality and how that would promote, buy-in across the board. So instead of, if it's only for, the so-called poor people or the, most needy, then people don't care about it as much because they're like, well, that's just for them, not me. And they can't see themselves ever being part of that, even though we know research shows that a lot of us end up needing to rely on the social security over our life course. But there is an argument for universalism. The other sort of point I did want to make is just to come back to my earlier points around what is it that we want the basic income for. And if it is about poverty alleviation, I think, of course, everything that we're talking about is extremely important. And I think in terms of sort of the feminist reflection here, we also need to think about the kinds of future that we're actually in, and that includes the climate crisis, and the kinds of ways we need to rethink economy, the way we think about the role of employment, economic security, and the role of economic growth is very, very important. And so there is a push to think about basic income as a way of underpinning, again, different forms of work that are not necessarily paid employment feeding growth economy, that you could, form and support ecological care, other kinds of work that are extremely important, but, are not sort of within this sort of growth paradigm that we often find ourselves. So I think that's important that we hold, because we're in a crisis and things could change and get real very, very quickly. So it's, and it does, like you see when floods hit and at very localized levels, folks' whole lives getting uprooted and their sort of relationship with their normal employment changes completely. And then you have these emergency payments that come in. But we need to think about what happens when that, when we really, that becomes actually the norm, and might be almost there.
Yes, well, there's no doubt we've bedded in warmer temperatures, and there are going to be implications, well, already. I guess it's a good point to perhaps explore with you, Helen Hodgeson, this question of workforce participation and impacts that Elise was pointing to. There may be a concern that people aren't going to work if they can get paid without formally working. And given the hostility with the referendum raising a kind of conservatism we know to be in the constituency, what effect did you find the idea of basic income or UBI, what did you find is its impact on workforce participation?
That is still something that is very much in the theoretical space, because we don't actually have with the exception of the emergency during COVID, we don't really have a system that is strong enough to be able to identify effects throughout the whole system. But the theoretical focus is the same as anything else, that if you give people income for not working, then they won't work, and then that will have the effect on productivity in terms of national outputs and so on. Now, that's something Angela, as an economist, is far better qualified to unpick than I am. But having said that, it's this whole issue around recognising, I think, as Elise said, we do need to recognise that it's not just productive paid work that is going on in the workforce. I mean, you can go right back to Marilyn Waring and identify that unpaid work has not been properly recognised for forever. Ever since they started measuring GDP, the unpaid work and the caring sector generally has been underrepresented in the way that we structure the economy. So I do agree that these forms of minimum basic income are a really important underpinning to free up, to give people the space to undertake those forms of work. And I do also agree with Elise's comments about the need to refocus efforts in this space around things like ecological care, as well as the care that we currently recognise for children and elders and so on. But that is the underlying concern that comes through in some of the economic literature, that it will have a slowing effect because people will choose not to work and will choose to put their energy into less productive areas. But
it's how that's framed, right? I mean, it's how it's framed, and Elise is saying,
yeah, that's it. The question for me is, what is less productive? Is caring less productive? Is art less productive?
I thought your paper, at least your literature review, showed that UBI schemes around the world actually don't reduce workforce participation, that people still want to work, even if they're entitled to an unconditional payment. So that's very promising, and that suggests people find ways to contribute, and in light of climate events and the need to support communities to recover, that's worth highlighting. What about participation payments? Where does that sit in this conversation in light of the climate debate?
So participation payments?
Yes, if it's about acknowledging caring, if it's about identifying where we are gender blind and appreciating work women do, is that where perhaps the conversation could go? And then I'll bring in Angela.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely needs to be a more formal recognition of the sorts of work that is done that doesn't necessarily fit within the current framework of that requires people to meet their mutual obligations. It's not regularly recognised that certain types of care work may not fall within the mutual obligation system. So yes, that does need to be addressed. Now, whether you give people payments specifically for exercising, for working in those areas, that could lead to, that could be one of the stepping stones that does say, well, we recognise that these forms of unpaid work are actually significant to the community and do fill a role. So that is something that we probably should be exploring.
Yeah, especially as the government is investing in creating workforces of retired ex-servicemen and women to work in communities in the wake of floods and fires. The government's prepared to throw money at participating and acknowledging with income the role of caring in that way in the wake of disasters. Angela, what's your perspective on some of this?
Sorry, so I'm just noting Eva Cox has got her hand up, and I thought maybe we could hear from her before I launch into my views. Is that all right?
Sure. I'm not seeing it, but
hi there, Eva. You should be able to speak now.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Oh, good. Yes. Sorry, I was sort of cut in on this. This is an area that I've actually done some work in the past. And I think you're talking about it as though we've got to deal with it within the context of the current system. And the current system, let's face it, is not working well. It's incredibly expensive, and it really damages a hell of a lot of the people that it actually deals with, because it's based on this idea that, that work according to male sort of structures, means that you have an identity. And taking the point that was made by Elise and things like that, that it's about time that as a feminist organisation, we took a good long look at the unpaid work and actually assumed that people should be paid for a whole range of things that they do. And the easiest way of doing that is by providing a universal income. You know, yes, there's a hell of a lot of people out there that feel that they're not going to have jobs. But we've got to get rid of that somewhere along the way, because the sort of world we're coming into now and some of the new technologies and the various other things are going to shift an enormous amount of what paid work is about. And the fact that we're dealing with disasters and the fact that we're dealing with a whole lot of other social areas which are just not covered. And I mean, I'd be very sad if ERA sort of came out with the idea that what we've got to do is sort of fix up what's actually a bad, old-fashioned, masculinized form of payments, which gives a whole lot of money to the private sector for showing us through courses that are not going to actually improve anything. So I mean, I just think we need to have a proper discussion about the fact that if we're trying to find a world that works and a society that works, we don't have to start with making profits.
Well, you also highlight, I guess, the world we live in and its changes in the workforce. Does AI accelerate the need for something like universal basic income?
Well, what they're going to try and do is sort of force us out of the workforce. So I think it's probably a very good idea if it does arrive, because we're going to have to spend an awful lot of time unpicking its errors, because I think it's not nearly as effective in doing things as people seem to be promoting it. But I do think that we actually need to start thinking about what sort of world do we want to get into and how do we serve these sorts of things. And and I just think a universal basic income needs to be discussed as a way of doing things. And there's a lot of attempts in trials and things that are going on. And in a lot of the world, it will actually do very well. And if we take a good long look at the indigenous stuff and the fact that we've now managed to say they're just like us, they're actually better off than us, but in many ways, because they would fall very comfortably into something like that, because they do know what their duties are and what the expectations are. And I think we've just got to recognise some of this.
Yeah, well, back to you, Angela. I mean, I also
know Angela's stuff I agreed with.
In the white paper, there is this set of there's a roadmap for actions. It's quite thin in the future-focused actions, actually, but there is this mention of considering further ways to support participation. There's an acknowledgement at the level of Treasury around how to do that, including for working age recipients, payment recipients. So, yeah, to you.
Yeah, so look, and I think just going off Eva's comments, you know, there is that, should we be operating within the current paradigm, the current policy settings in Australia, where it's this targeted social security system, and we want to tweak it to make it sort of work a bit better. There's an element where I think, look, realistically, you're more likely to get change if you work within the current system, but there are clearly strong arguments for a UBI. And so the question, I guess, for the ERA is it strong enough to go, yep, let's back this in, and why would we back it in? And I think Elise's points around, you know, it is clearly, you know, if properly designed, and design always matters. So I think when people say that, design matters on any policy, so that's fine. Like, you know, you can design policies to ensure that they don't have the negative consequences in terms of feminist objectives. But you know, clearly the idea that at the moment we have a system where 50% of the work that happens in the economy, the majority of which women do, is not paid, and we would move as a society, we would say, well, we should pay for that, and we should recognise that that is work and that is productive work, and that, you know, we will use the tax and transfer system to pay for that work, and that will have a gendered impact, is a fairer, more feminist society, and something that you can sign up to pretty easily, right? Like, it's not to say that paid work isn't important and that women shouldn't be supported to do paid work, but it would recognise a reality of women's lives whereby we effectively just do all this unpaid work and end up more likely to experience poverty both through our lives and in retirement. So surely a world where that didn't occur would be a good thing. On the other side, it alleviates poverty, which has all these ramifications, which are very negative. And we can see that in terms of intergenerational disadvantage in Australia. You know, the impacts on children is what gets me, you know, like we put families in poverty. You know, we have 1 in 6 kids in poverty, and we know they do worse at school. We know their health outcomes are worse. We know their labour force participation is worse. We know the chance of, you know, experiencing abuse and violence is higher. And yet we put families in this situation. We make that decision with our current system to do that. And we're a wealthy country that doesn't need to make that choice. We could easily make a different choice. So why wouldn't you make a different choice? And does it negatively impact work? Because what the economic rationalists would say is, well, and the evidence says, no, it doesn't actually. You know, as long as there's still a benefit of working, which you can design a UBI so that, you know, you still benefit from working. People generally do want to work, and actually by taking people out of poverty, they can make better choices around, you know, education, life choices. So they're not under that financial stress where people tend to make worse decisions, and things can, you know, just sort of roll on, and people can get themselves stuck in worse and worse situations. So why wouldn't you support a UBI, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. So
I mean, like, you know, like, so in terms of, would that, if you were starting again, yes, it would make sense, right?
But we're not.
But we're not. So then it's like, well, then how do you sort of try and get there? And I think you can run both races though, right? Like,
you're right to say that on paper, this is at least very interesting. Potential advantages are there, but given the political climate, you know, and that's what we're working in, the political environment, perhaps it's still a matter for long-term discussion that ERA is saying should help put on the agenda as a practical proposal for implementation down the track. So given your, I guess, engagement over many years now working across tax, fiscal and social policy, it's something that you'd expect Treasury to go, yeah, let's test it. Let's talk about it, at least.
And that's where I think that the absolutely fundamental thing here is that even if there are still some conditions around a payment, the mutual obligation system is so appallingly badly designed, and the effects are so dreadful on the people who are bound by it, that's the first thing that has to be examined and reviewed, and remove some of these more punitive conditions. And to go back to the concept that was discussed earlier about deserving and undeserving, there should not be that distinction there, because things can happen to anybody. And just because somebody is not in the paid workforce does not mean they're not contributing to society. So that whole mutual obligation, I think, is one of the fundamental design points that, and that's where I would actually say the first pressure should come in terms of what we can be doing to work towards a better designed social security system and some level of minimum/universal support, is to deal with that the punitive system of mutual obligation.
But it's a little bit of chicken and egg, isn't it? I mean, in terms of, it's a values piece, and when people see that if everyone gets X amount, it's not means tested, the sky doesn't fall in. And so shifting an attitude in the Australian public that helps government and Treasury move along is kind of where we're at. And yet what comes first in order to reduce stigmatisation that currently goes on with the concept of welfare? So is that the tension?
Yeah, I think there is a tension there, and I think there is a tension in terms of Lisa's gone, whether the, you know, and certainly through, you know, probably revealing stuff, but through, you know, the processes that I'm involved in, the mutual obligation is definitely front and centre in terms of a real appreciation within the bureaucracy and just more broadly that it's a real problem. The politics of it, though, is hard, right? Like, it is, the reality is, especially when you have the current political environment, is if the current government does stuff in this space, I mean, you know, you can write the press release on what's going to come back from the other side, right? And they will go hard on this, and they will create the division and everything we've seen over the last month, you know, again, in terms of people who are unemployed and the undeserving, and it won't be pretty. There is that question about whether the politics of the universality, as with Medicare, and a complete redesign, or maybe you do an earned income tax credit or another approach, is potentially easier in some ways, like the big bang, everyone benefits, this is what you get out of it, because that's what people want to know, right? What do I get out of it? They don't really care about people in poverty, if we're honest, like the politics, they don't care. Like we care, but they don't, you know, the middle Australia doesn't care. So maybe going big is better. Maybe going bigger is easier politically, because then you're selling something, a really big idea where everyone benefits, and you can do a table and you can make sure that middle income earners are benefiting, and, you know, all those types of things, the cameos.
And it would also be remiss of us not to say that any of these sorts of systems ultimately depend on having a properly progressive tax system.
Yeah.
A properly progressive tax structure, which means that whether the UBI is part of it by means of removing tax thresholds or whether it's designed in some other way, ultimately you have to say that if people are earning more, they should be paying more tax to help support societal structures. So that progressivity is incredibly significant. Now, I will come back to one of the technical issues around universal versus minimum, and that is that if it is a universal system, you effectively have to have it incorporated in the tax system in a way that claws it back from people who are high income earners. Through the progressivity of the tax system, you need to be able to claw it back, and that way it's there, it's available, but because you don't need it, you are contributing more into the system through taxes than you would if it was outside the tax system. And this is one of the issues we see at the moment with the tax-free superannuation for people who are over 60. People are still benefiting from the supports that people get through Medicare and the aged care support and so on, but they're not contributing because it's outside the tax system.
Thank you, Helen. So aside from the need to properly implement a truly progressive tax system, and really that pointing to some key design issues going forward, there is a question from someone online, Roger, who's asking about the cost. We did answer, part of his question is about what happens to participation rates. What's the evidence that people will choose to do paid work if they do not have to? And we pointed out, Roger, earlier that there's negligible impact, at least based on the limited implementation of basic income globally. But his second part of that question is, where does the money come from? Or rather, I guess, a question about affordability. My reading is that it is affordable because it's so much less complex than the current welfare system, based on a safety net concept that you make savings in administration alone, while the remainder is also certainly less than the cost of things such as a nuclear submarine fleet. I mean, it is about priorities as well. You know, there's talking about cost, but then it's also understanding cost relative to priorities. So does anyone want to talk to sort of the cost of something like a basic minimum income or UBI?
Look, so I think overall, I mean, it all depends on the design, right? So,
yeah.
And I think Helen went to, you know, that you would, if you did do a UBI or in it, you would then have this progressive tax system. So you'd try and offset some of the costs. And so then affordability really comes down to that. I think, look, you are talking though about a substantial additional investment, you know, to lift people out of poverty. So let's not pretend like it won't, you know, cost additional money. It will. The question is, you know, as I think Elise, you pointed to, you know, you've got these stage 3 tax cuts, which are also going to cost sort of $20 billion a year. And if you've diverted that down, then you could, you know, address some of these issues and certainly get you a very long way along the path to funding a UBI, and you would save money in terms of that administration cost. That's probably not substantial really in the grand scheme of things, because you are talking about a lot of money, but it does all come down to the design and how you design it, and what level you'd set the UBI, of course. You know, whether you do it as a proportion of the minimum wage, or you'd set it at something around, you know, what's a basic level to live a, you know, a good life in Australia, or a, you know, that basic level of, you know, cover housing costs, food costs, etc. So it depends on a number of moving factors.
Yes. Do you think perhaps with time, and Elise, if you'd like to pop in here, given the climate stuff, you know, it's hard to overcome the current public perception that government payment should only go to people who deserve them, right? We've acknowledged that. But there are practical barriers. But perhaps there will be greater public acceptance of the changes necessary to move in the direction we've talked about because of new flood and fire events.
I mean, that's quite possible. That's quite possible. But all and you know, when crisis happens, all sorts of new possibilities emerge in what people will accept and won't. I mean, look what we lived through during COVID. I mean, if you had have said, "Oh, the government's going to lock us down for years," before understanding the context of this disease, this virus, that you know, people would have just said, no way, that's politically impossible. And actually, I think that was the same kind of story that came with with Medicare, is people said, no, that's going to be impossible. And then, you know, people end up, you know, accepting it. I mean, but that's probably the power of universalism actually in the Medicare story. But, you know, in terms of the cost, like, I think it also goes to the kind of story that's being told about a basic income. And I think that's, you know, useful to think about in terms of, and I'm sorry, because the ANU internet just stopped. So I'm sorry about that, but we're back. So I didn't get to hear everything, Helen, that you were saying, but in terms of thinking about the basic income and cost in line with the tax system, I think is absolutely essential. Like, it's impossible to talk about cost without thinking about redistribution and how, you know, a basic income is a mechanism for redistribution, not just poverty alleviation, but actually as a mechanism to reduce inequality across the economy. I think that's a very essential part. And that's an important story to be told. But also, if there's a bigger story around the kinds of, you know, changes like Eva was talking about moving beyond the sort of current paradigm into something new and more forward-facing and future-proof, then, you know, there's possibly more buy-in. And so just to sort of wrap back, actually, Toni, to your sort of question around sort of ERA, and I think, you know, if people agree with the basic income or universal basic income or not on the level of cost or implementation or what have you, I think you can't deny the power of the political demand that it makes and the way in which it changes conversations and the kinds of conversations that then become possible to have when you're talking about a basic income. And I think that's a very powerful thing for us to sort of think about too, is the kinds of conversations the demand of a basic income does open up for us. And I think that's very exciting. If, you know, and Angela, I think the point around sort of, you know, design and implementation can be worked out, but, you know, there's something very powerful about the demand here.
Fantastic. Well, I think, you know, let's not push the conversation further than we have to. We've done a great job. You've done a great job of kind of containing the complexity, putting out the headlines and unpacking some of it. Perhaps we could just go across the panel with some closing remarks, keeping in mind very much Eva's point about what about the social side of life, what about the role women make. What Angela pointed to is 50% of work in the economy is done by women and it's not recognised. That's an astonishing percentage. So we're not just talking about productivity, we're not talking about participation as we formally know it, but what helps us thrive? What helps communities thrive? So perhaps to you first, Helen, by way of a summary statement about what you've heard and the way forward.
Okay, so I think that there definitely has to be a conversation about what is wrong with our welfare system. And the key things that are wrong with the welfare system revolve around the punitive nature, the deserved, undeserved, the mutual obligation. And that's before you even get to the quantum of payments, which, as Angela said, income poverty is a terrible thing and it does need to be addressed. So a UBI/MBI is definitely a form of redistribution that we should be looking at. But primarily, in my view, it's around removing the conditionality that's attached to it through the mutual obligation and through addressing some of the gaps that people face in the context of services. So making sure that those services that are meant to be universal, and I know that because Angela mentioned Medicare, over time gaps have emerged, and those are contributing to the problems that that low-income people are facing. And I think that making sure that these are addressed and that there is in fact a without mutual obligation, it will ensure that people, particularly women, who are focusing on things other than formal paid employment, are still recognised for the contribution they're making to the economy.
Thank you. Angela?
Muted myself. Yeah, look, I think for me, and maybe this is a slightly different angle, like, so I think for me, the mutual obligation stuff sort of, I'm not saying, it's definitely acknowledged within policy circles within government in any case. So there is that political discussion. And I guess the question is, well, how do you win that political debate? And for me, I think there is a gendered element to this, but really it comes down to reconceptualizing what the cost of poverty is in Australia so that we can understand, and the Australian public is better able to understand that actually this system, which, you know, is only around the deserving and it's very targeted, is creating this huge amount of poverty across the board, and this has real costs associated with it. And I think going to those costs, understanding, conceptualize, so that the Australian public can really hopefully get that by alleviating poverty, we can reduce costs, and so they benefit as well, so that they have a buy-in to why we might want to address poverty. To me is like the next political redefinition, because at the moment I think there really is that idea that it's not my problem, it doesn't affect me, I don't need to worry about it. And I think just really understanding and unpacking why people should be worried about poverty, even if it's only from self-interest point of view. And I know that's, you know, we might not agree, we might think we need to take different angles. And then I think the UBI within that, though, can really open up those debates in terms of what the benefits might be, because the real benefit from a UBI in my mind is alleviating that poverty, it is reducing the MTRs, and yes, it has a feminist angle to it, and yes, in terms of, you know, the insurance perspective from climate change, from all these natural disasters, it has those benefits, but really from the solid economic base, it's around that, right? It's around, if you have a UBI, you can address poverty, that has huge economic benefits. It means, you know, people are able to fully participate in society and the economy, it means kids aren't growing up in poor households, all those sort of benefits, and it's big. So I guess, yeah, in terms of next steps, what I'd say is I think it's really worth considering. I think it's really worth fleshing out. And I think there's that strong, and I think Elise has articulated well, that strong feminist angle to it. But I think from the context of reconceptualizing what this cost of poverty and income poverty is in particular is really important, and needs to be that not re-education, clearly re-education, but we really need to have that discussion, because I think at the moment, and COVID showed us that we had the example of what happens when you actually just give people enough money to live on. We need to rehab that and re-prosecute that discussion in Australia, because it really, I mean, it's such I don't want to, like we do have, Medicare is good, our hospitals are good. And I get to Helen's point, there are these costs associated, but we do have a good, the services are good, but the income, like we just more than like it's the worst in the, one of the worst in the OECD in terms of the rate. We really, really punish people. We really put people into quite severe poverty in this country. And there is no need.
The costs of that are substantial.
Yeah,
right?
the costs of that are substantial. That's right. And there's no need. Like we are we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And yet
so it comes back to attitudes.
It does. And I think reframing it is really important.
Okay, terrific. So lastly to you, Elise, if you wanted to sum up or suggest the way forward, or is this something you haven't raised, or is there new research you're embarking on that you want to let us with? We've highlighted that this is an attractive idea in principle and in action, but it is about design and the complexity of design issues and educating the Australian public to gain public acceptance. Yeah, but is there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would just underline, this deservingness, undeservingness. We really needs to be like a major political fight here. But I think it is also wrapped to our sort of obsession with employment as, being, linked to people being seen as contributors. And I think we need to sort of really put heat on that and just to sort of reflect on that this is not the only economic model that's possible. And in fact, it's not the only economic model here in Australia. And to your point, your question about current research, colleagues, myself here at the ANU are working with June Oscar's team at the Australian Human Rights Commission. June Oscar is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. She's been embarking on this extraordinary piece of work around yarning with First Nations women across the country. And we've been specifically working with her team around the role of unpaid care in Indigenous communities and just how essential that work is in terms of supporting Indigenous economies and also pushing back against the impacts of colonisation, ongoing impacts of colonisation in terms of the trauma, the continued taking of children, the ecological impacts of contemporary colonisation. And so, this idea of unpaid care is actually a central tenet of, a lot of Indigenous communities and is undertaken by women, but also men too. And it's not seen as something that, is a burden or, something to move away from, but something to be embraced and is a central tenet of what it means to, be in community and connected. I think that's an important point to remember too, is that we are talking about a colonial system here, and we are blessed in this country that there is diversity and possibility all around us if we only stop to listen and to think about the kinds of other possibilities out there, and not to essentialize because, there's a lot of struggle and difficulty, but to just say there are other possibilities out there. We're not stuck in this paradigm if we care to listen.
Thank you. A fitting point, caring to listen. I want to thank you for your contribution and for all of us online who are listening to Dr Elise Klein, Associate Professor of Public Policy, Crawford School at the ANU. Elise has organised a recent conference too, which I failed to mention at the outset, called Basic Income After COVID-19. Thank you to Helen Hodgeson, Professor at Curtin Law School and at the Curtin Business School at Curtin University. Helen is also a member of the ACOS Tax and Superannuation Advisory Group, and with, of course, the National Foundation of Australian Women as an ERA member. And thank you to Dr Angela Jackson. Lovely to have you along as well, lead economist with Impact Economics and Policy. And thank you for contributing to an important conversation and really thickening it for us as we go forward in our advocacy on this topic. Do well, stay well, and I'll throw now to Helen Daly-Fisher, my colleague.
Thanks very much, Toni. I am just working out how to get myself back in. Hooray, I've emerged. Thank you, everyone. That was really fantastic. And I think that what we've done is identify that there is perhaps a preliminary piece of work for us to do around developing an ERA position on the welfare system in particular, but more broadly around the way we perceive different kinds of work. We have already identified that we want to encourage the revaluing of the work done by women, particularly the unpaid work done by women, but also the paid caring work done by women. And this seems to me to be a natural corollary of that, which is that we then say, well, how does that process of valuing the work done by women feed into the construction of our welfare sector and our welfare systems? So I think we've identified a very large piece of work for the ERA to start getting our teeth into. For participants and people listening to the recording who are interested in continuing this work, if you're associated with an organisation that's in ERA's APAC, our Advocacy and Policy Advisory Council, then you can join our work group on this work by using the link that's in the chat, which I will just repeat now. And you will see that I think over the next, let's say, year, we're going to work quite hard to start interrogating that question about how it is that we perceive people who are receiving welfare payments. What are the stories that we're telling about, particularly about women who are doing work whilst receiving those payments, and how is it that what is it that we are attempting to achieve? What's the end goal that we're heading towards in terms of a welfare system? Particularly that point that Eva was raising about, well, where does this sit in our conception of what Australia looks like? So thank you all very much for your fabulous and expert views. We will be making this recording available. So if there's anything in it you want to check, feel free to come back to it. We'll send the link around. And go well, everybody. Thank you very much.